The cowboy didn't reach for the widow first. He reached for the poisoned water bucket sitting beside her dead horse. Rain slammed against the barn roof as the stranger dragged the coughing boy away from the flooded pasture. The widow slipped in the mud, fingers numb from cold, while somewhere upriver wood cracked like a gunshot in the dark. Then the cowboy looked toward the canyon and said something that made her blood turn cold. What would you have done that night? The winter of 1886 settled hard over the Bitterroot Valley. Snow packed deep against the fences around Harper Ranch, turning the fields white and silent except for the groan of wind through the cottonwoods. The north pasture stood nearly empty now. Only 5 horses remained inside the lower enclosure, their ribs faintly visible beneath dull winter coats. 2 more had died that month. Evelyn Harper stood beside the watering trough with her gloves damp and stiff from the cold. A thin layer of ice floated across the surface of the bucket in her hand. She broke it apart with the handle of a hammer and watched the water underneath ripple darkly in the fading light. Something was wrong with it. Again, she could smell it some mornings. Not always. Sometimes it carried a bitter edge, like rust and wet stone. Other days it looked clean enough to drink herself, but the horses knew before she did. They pulled away from the trough, nervous and restless, ears twitching toward the North Canyon. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Noah stepped onto the porch wrapped in his father's old wool coat, the sleeves hanging too long over his hands. "You going into town tomorrow?" he asked. Evelyn kept her eyes on the water. "Have to." "The bank again?" She nodded once. Noah said nothing after that. He was 12 now and had already learned when silence helped more than questions. Far across the pasture, the windmill turned slow and uneven against a gray evening sky. The people in Red Hollow had started calling the place Dead Ranch, sometime after the second horse collapsed near the creek. Evelyn heard it first inside Grady's feed store when 2 men stopped talking the moment she walked in. After that, she heard it everywhere. Dead Ranch. Widow Harper's place. A woman alone can't hold land that size. She stopped correcting them months ago. That night, the storm rolled down from the mountains fast. By sundown, the windows rattled under heavy wind, and snow swept across the yard thick enough to erase the wagon tracks leading to the barn. Evelyn finished securing the chicken coop while Noah carried firewood inside 2 pieces at a time. The lantern hanging near the porch swung wildly. Then somewhere beyond the storm came the sound of hooves, faint at first, then closer. Noah looked toward the road immediately. Someone's coming. Nobody visited Harper Ranch after dark. Evelyn rested one hand near the shotgun beside the door before stepping onto the porch. Snow blew hard across her face. At the gate, barely visible through the white haze, a rider sat motionless on a dark horse. The man dismounted slowly, tall, broad shoulders beneath a snow-covered duster. Hat pulled low against the wind, he kept both hands where she could see them. "Evenin', Mom," he called over the storm. His voice carried low and steady. "Horse needs water worse than I do." Evelyn did not move. "You lost?" "No, Mom." The stranger glanced toward the barn. "Storm caught me later than I figured." Noah stepped closer behind her. Evelyn could feel the boy watching every movement the man made. The cowboy removed his gloves slowly, careful, like someone used to approaching frightened animals. "My name's Wyatt Granger," he said. "I can sleep in the barn if you've got room for 1 more horse." Snow gathered along the brim of his hat. His gelding stood trembling near the fence, sides dark with sweat beneath the frost. Evelyn studied him another long moment before nodding once toward the trough beside the pump. "Water's there." Wyatt led the horse forward without another word. The lantern light caught his face briefly. Older than she first thought, mid-30s maybe. A thin scar crossed one side of his jaw near the beard line. He filled the bucket halfway, then stopped. His eyes narrowed slightly at the water. He lifted some in his palm and smelled it. Noah noticed first. "What is it?" Wyatt stayed quiet a second too long. Then he poured the water slowly back into the trough. Something's poisoning your North Spring. The wind seemed to disappear for one strange second. Evelyn felt her chest tighten beneath her coat. Most men came to the ranch talking too fast, offering guesses, talking drought or sickness or weak stock. This man looked at the water less than 10 seconds and knew. Noah stared at him openly now. Wyatt rubbed his thumb against the wet leather edge of the bucket. Silver runoff, maybe, he said quietly, or chemicals from upstream, but it ain't natural. Evelyn swallowed carefully. How would you know that? His gaze lifted toward the dark outline of the North Canyon. Water leaves signs if you know where to look. Snow hissed against the porch roof. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Wyatt straightened slowly. There's an old drainage route somewhere north of here, isn't there? Evelyn felt something cold move through her stomach. There was. Her husband had shown it to her years ago, after they bought the ranch. An old runoff cut through the canyon rock from abandoned mining land farther uphill. Nobody else in town even remembered it existed. You worked mines before? She asked carefully. No, Mom. Then, how do you know about runoff channels around here? Wyatt looked back at her, calm. Hard to read. Because this ain't the first poisoned creek I've seen. Noah stepped closer toward the man despite himself. You really think that's what killed the horses? Wyatt looked toward the pasture where the wind pushed loose snow across the fence lines. Yes, he said. The answer came too fast to be guessing. Evelyn tightened her grip around the porch rail. Part of her wanted to shut the door and send him back into the storm before he carried more trouble onto her land. Another part of her had not heard anyone speak to her like she wasn't imagining things in almost a year. Wyatt rested one hand lightly against his horse's neck. I can take a look at the canyon come morning, he said. Water lines too, if you've got any running under the east side. Evelyn frowned slightly. How'd you know about the east line? The ground dips there. He nodded toward the pasture. Snow's thinner over buried pipe. Again that feeling. Like the man was reading the ranch instead of looking at it. And what do you want in return? She asked. Wyatt glanced toward the barn. A dry place for the horse. A pause. Maybe some coffee. Noah looked at his mother hopefully before trying to hide it. The storm deepened around them, thick white against the dark valley. Finally, Evelyn stepped aside from the porch. The barn stays warmer near the south wall, she said quietly. There's hay in the loft. Wyatt touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat once. Much obliged. As he led the horse toward the barn, Noah leaned closer to his mother. You trust him? Evelyn watched the stranger disappear into the blowing snow. No, she said softly. But for the first time in months, she no longer felt completely alone standing there in the cold. The storm lasted through most of the night. Wind rattled the loose boards along the barn roof, while snow piled deep against the corrals. Evelyn slept lightly in the narrow bed beside the window, waking every few hours to the sound of the house settling against the cold. Just before dawn, she heard footsteps outside, not hurried, steady. She pulled on her robe and looked through the frost-covered glass. Wyatt Granger was already at the pump. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat as he worked the frozen handle, loose, with slow, patient pressure. Beside him stood Noah, holding a lantern with both hands tucked inside his sleeves. The boy was talking. Wyatt listened more than he spoke. Evelyn watched a moment longer before heading downstairs. The kitchen still carried yesterday's coffee smell mixed with wood smoke from the stove. She added fresh grounds to the enamel pot and set biscuits back near the heat to warm. By the time Wyatt stepped inside, the sun had barely risen over the mountains. He stopped near the doorway automatically, careful not to bring snow onto the floorboards. You don't need to stand there freezing, Evelyn said. He removed his hat slowly. Didn't want to track mud through the house. There's not enough left in this place worth protecting from mud. The words came out sharper than she intended. Wyatt said nothing to it. Noah sat at the table watching him openly now. You really worked water lines before? The boy asked. Some. How many? Wyatt accepted the coffee cup Evelyn slid toward him. His hands were rough and scarred from old work. Enough to know trouble when I smell it. He drank once, then looked toward the north window. I'd like to see the spring before noon. Evelyn folded her arms. Road's nearly buried. Horse can still make it. She studied him over the rim of her own cup. Most men would have kept riding after hearing this ranch was cursed. The corner of Wyatt's mouth shifted faintly. Most men don't know much about land. After breakfast, he went straight to work, not talking, just moving. He repaired the broken hinge on the South Corral gate before Evelyn even mentioned it. Then he spent nearly an hour near the windmill, knocking ice from the frozen gears with the back of a wrench, while Noah handed him tools from the snow. By afternoon, the wheel turned smooth again. Evelyn stood on the porch with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, listening to the steady creak of the blades overhead. She had almost forgotten what that sound used to feel like. Later, they rode north together. The canyon trail narrowed beyond the cottonwoods, where old mining roads disappeared into the hills. Snow lay deeper there, beneath the pines. Wyatt dismounted twice to study the ground near the creek bed. The second time he crouched beside the water without speaking. "What is it?" Evelyn asked quietly. He pointed downstream. Half hidden beneath snow near the rocks lay the body of a deer. Another farther up, both close to the water. Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. That didn't die from winter. He moved farther along the creek until he found wagon tracks nearly buried beneath fresh snow. Old tracks, heavy wheels, mining wheels. "There's an abandoned silver camp east of here," he asked. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Closed years ago, not closed enough." The wind shifted hard through the canyon, then carrying a bitter metallic smell neither of them could ignore anymore. That evening, Red Hollow already seemed different. People stared longer when Evelyn walked into Grady's general store, with Wyatt beside her carrying feed sacks over one shoulder. Conversation thinned near the stove where three ranchers sat playing cards. One man muttered quietly enough to almost miss. Widow found herself company. Wyatt kept walking like he hadn't heard it. Evelyn felt heat rise behind her eyes anyway. At church that Sunday, Pastor Collins spoke longer than usual about appearances and temptation. He never used her name, but every woman in the room knew who the sermon belonged to. Evelyn kept her gaze forward through the whole thing. Outside afterward, snowmelt dripped steadily from the church roof into muddy wagon ruts. "You don't owe those people explanations," Wyatt said while tightening his saddle strap. She looked at him sharply. "Easy for you to say. You can ride away whenever you like." The words landed harder than she intended. Wyatt paused only a second. "Yes, Mom," he said quietly. Then he mounted his horse without another word. That night, Noah woke burning with fever. The boy's hands shook beneath the blankets while cold sweat dampened his hair. Evelyn sat beside the bed, helplessly pressing cool cloths against his forehead as the storm returned outside. "We need Dr. Bennett," she whispered. "The roads are closed," Noah muttered weakly. Before Evelyn could answer, Wyatt was already pulling on his coat near the door. "You can't ride through that," she said. "I can try." Snow hammered the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Evelyn stepped toward him. "You barely know us." Wyatt pulled his gloves tight slowly. "Ain't about that?" For one strange second, neither moved. Then he opened the door and the storm swallowed him whole. Hours passed. The lantern burned low. Evelyn sat beside Noah, listening to the wind and wondering whether she had just sent another man out into the dark to die because of this ranch. Near dawn came the sound of hooves again. She ran outside without her coat. Wyatt rode into the yard covered in snow beside Dr. Bennett's wagon, his horse nearly collapsing beneath him from exhaustion. As the doctor hurried inside, Wyatt slid stiffly from the saddle. One hand pressed hard against his ribs where blood had soaked through part of his coat from a fall, somewhere along the ridge trail. Evelyn stared at it. "You're hurt." "Horse slipped crossing Miller Pass," he said simply. Then he looked past her toward the upstairs window where Noah slept. "Boy still breathing?" Evelyn nodded slowly. Wyatt exhaled once through the cold. Only then did she realize he had ridden through half the Bitterroot storm, carrying a broken rib for a child who wasn't his. And for the first time since her husband died, fear touched her in a different way entirely. Not fear of losing the ranch. Fear of what would happen if Wyatt Granger ever left it. March loosened its grip on the valley slowly. Snow still covered the higher ridges above Bitterroot, but the lower fields around Harper Ranch had begun turning dark with thawed earth and wagon ruts. Water moved again beneath the ice along the creek bed. Some mornings Evelyn could hear it from the porch before sunrise. Wyatt had rerouted part of the north flow through an older rock channel east of the canyon 2 weeks earlier. Since then, not a single horse had fallen sick. It was the first good stretch they'd had in nearly a year. The ranch felt different now. Alive in small ways, smoke rising steady from the chimney, tack hanging dry inside the barn instead of abandoned in corners. Noah laughing sometimes without realizing it first. One morning Evelyn came downstairs and found Wyatt at the kitchen table, repairing a bridle strap beside the stove, while Noah read aloud from an old cattle ledger. The scene stopped her for half a second, not because anything unusual was happening, because it looked natural. Wyatt glanced up immediately and stood. Sorry. Didn't mean to crowd the place. You're not crowding anything, Evelyn said before she could stop herself. Silence settled briefly after that. Wyatt nodded once and sat back down. Outside, the windmill turned smooth against a pale blue sky. Later that week, they rode north again. The abandoned silver camp sat higher in the canyon than Evelyn remembered, half buried beneath years of weather and pine growth. Broken carts leaned against collapsed structures, and old mining rails disappeared beneath mud and snowmelt. Wyatt dismounted near the creek. Something had disturbed the ground recently. Fresh boot prints, not many days old. He crouched beside a rusted drainage barrel near the waterline and rubbed something dark between his fingers. Chemical residue. Evelyn watched his face tighten slightly. Someone's been here, he said. Mining stopped years ago. Doesn't mean the dumping did. A crow called somewhere high above the canyon walls. Then Wyatt noticed something else. Horse tracks, heavy ones, too large for mining ponies. Ranch horses, the kind owned by men with money. That night the barn caught fire. It started just after midnight. Noah smelled the smoke first. Evelyn woke to shouting outside, and orange light spilling across the bedroom walls. By the time she reached the porch, flames had already climbed halfway up the barn's west side, sparks blowing wild through the dark wind. Wyatt! She ran barefoot into the yard. Inside the barn, horses screamed and kicked against their stalls in panic. Then she saw him. Wyatt burst through the smoke, leading 2 terrified mares by their reins, while burning hay crashed behind him from the loft above. Get them clear, he shouted. Noah grabbed one horse near the fence line while Evelyn fought to calm the other. The heat rolled across the yard hard enough to sting her face. Then suddenly, Wyatt disappeared back inside. Wyatt! Evelyn screamed. No answer. The roof groaned overhead. A moment later, he emerged carrying tack over one shoulder and coughing hard. One sleeve burned black near the elbow. Together, they managed to save most of the horses before neighbors finally arrived with buckets and blankets. By dawn, the barn still stood, barely. Smoke drifted from the ruined roof while wet ash covered the yard like dirty snow. Wyatt sat near the water trough afterward, washing soot from a cut along his shoulder. His shirt hung half open where the fabric had burned through. That was when Evelyn saw the scars. Old ones. Long pale marks crossing his back beneath the lantern light. Not ranch injuries. Something worse. Wyatt noticed her looking and quietly pulled the shirt closed again. Neither spoke about it. Sheriff Tom Avery arrived just after sunrise, smelling faintly of whiskey and cigar smoke. He walked through the burned barn slowly with his thumbs hooked inside his belt. Lantern accident, probably, he muttered. No lantern was lit, Evelyn said sharply. The sheriff barely looked at her. Storm winds do strange things. Wyatt stood nearby silent, studying boot prints near the rear barn door, half hidden beneath muddy ash. Someone had poured lamp oil there, deliberately. Before he could speak, another rider appeared at the gate. Silas Mercer, tall, gray coat, expensive gloves, the richest rancher in Red Hollow. He removed his hat slowly while looking over the burned barn. "Terrible shame," he said. Evelyn's jaw tightened immediately. Mercer had been trying to buy Harper Ranch since before her husband died. "Maybe this is a sign," he continued calmly. "Land this cursed ain't worth burying yourself over." Wyatt looked at him for the first time then. Really looked. Mercer smiled faintly beneath his mustache. "You must be the drifter, Wyatt Granger." Mercer nodded once. "Heard about you. Heard you're getting comfortable here." The sheriff chuckled under his breath. Evelyn felt anger rise hot beneath her ribs. Before she could answer, Noah stepped quietly out of the shadows near the porch, carrying a water bucket. He stopped when he heard Mercer speaking low to Sheriff Avery near the fence line. "Doesn't matter now," Mercer muttered. "That land'll be mine before winter anyway." The words landed cold and sharp in the morning air. Noah froze. Mercer noticed him a second too late. For one brief second, the smile vanished from the rancher's face completely. And Noah suddenly understood something terrible. The fire had never been about the barn. Someone wanted Wyatt gone. Spring rain came early that year. For 3 straight days, clouds sat low over the Bitterroots, turning the valley gray and heavy. Water rolled down every slope around Harper Ranch, filling wagon ruts and flooding the lower grass near the corrals. Wyatt spent most of those days outside, fixing fence posts, reinforcing drainage trenches, watching the river. Evelyn noticed he checked the North Ridge more often now. Sometimes he stood still for long stretches near the pasture gate, listening to things she could not hear. The rebuilt section of barn still smelled faintly of wet ash and fresh pine boards. Wyatt slept there anyway, every night, no matter how cold it got. One evening, Evelyn carried coffee out to him, while rain tapped steadily against the roof. He was repairing a saddle strap beside the lantern hanging from a beam overhead. "You should be inside," she said. "So should you." She handed him the tin cup. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange. Wyatt's hand was warm, despite the rain. "You don't have to keep sleeping out here," Evelyn said quietly. His eyes lifted toward her, then away again. "Yes, Mom," he answered softly. "I do." The word settled between them heavier than either expected. Neither spoke after that. Rainwater dripped steadily from the barn roof into the mud below. 2 nights later, the river rose. It happened fast. Near midnight, Noah burst through the bedroom door, half-dressed and breathless. The south pasture fence gave out. Evelyn was already pulling on her boots when she heard it. The river, not flowing anymore, roaring. She ran outside into cold rain and saw dark water crashing through the lower fields beneath flashes of lightning. Somewhere upstream, something massive had broken loose. Wyatt was crossing the yard toward the horses before she could even call his name. "Get lanterns," he shouted. Noah pointed toward the far pasture. "The gray colt's trapped." Beyond the flooded fence line, one young horse struggled wildly near the rising current. Without thinking, Noah climbed onto the rail and jumped down into the storm. "Noah!" Evelyn screamed. The boy disappeared into rain and darkness. Wyatt was already moving. He swung onto his horse bareback and drove straight toward the riverbank. While thunder cracked across the valley, hard enough to shake the ground beneath them, Evelyn followed on foot through ankle-deep water, slipping in mud as rain lashed her face. She saw Noah then, stranded against a cluster of cottonwoods near the bend where floodwater tore through the pasture. The colt panicked beside him, and upstream, part of the old timber dam came crashing apart. Someone had cut it loose. Wyatt forced the horse into the current. For one terrible second, both disappeared beneath the water entirely before reappearing farther downstream. "Noah!" Evelyn screamed again. The boy reached for Wyatt's arm just as another wave slammed into them sideways. Wyatt caught him, pulled him hard against the saddle. Then the horse lost footing near the rocks. Evelyn saw Wyatt shove Noah clear toward shallow ground an instant before the river ripped him backward into the dark current. The horse screamed, then vanished downstream with him. Everything after that blurred. Men from nearby ranches arrived carrying ropes and lanterns through the rain. Somebody pulled Noah onto the bank while Evelyn fought against 3 different hands trying to hold her back from the water. "He's still out there!" Lightning flashed across the canyon. Then one rancher shouted from downstream. They found Wyatt wedged against broken rocks near the river, bent half-conscious, and barely holding onto a tree root with one bleeding hand. It took 4 men to pull him free. By the time they carried him inside the house, his skin felt cold as river stone. Evelyn knelt beside the bed while Dr. Bennett cut away the soaked shirt from Wyatt's shoulders. Bruises darkened across his ribs and chest where the rocks had struck him beneath the water. "He's lucky," the doctor muttered quietly. Lucky did not look like this. For 2 days, Wyatt drifted in and out of fever. Rain continued against the windows, while the whole ranch moved quieter around him. Evelyn slept little. She changed cold cloths beside the bed through the night and kept fresh coffee warming near the stove for when the doctor returned. Sometimes she caught Noah standing silently in the doorway, watching Wyatt breathe. The boy blamed himself. She could see it. Late on the second night, Noah finally spoke, very quietly. "I heard Mercer talking last month." Evelyn looked up sharply. The fire cracked low in the stove. Noah twisted his father's old hat between nervous hands. "At Grady's store. Him and 2 men from the Ridge camp." He swallowed hard. "They were talking about poisoning the spring before winter ended." The room went completely still. Outside, the storm finally began moving east beyond the mountains. Evelyn stared toward Wyatt, lying pale beneath the blankets. Everything she had feared, everything she had suspected, it had all been true, and the only witness was her 12-year-old son. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked softly as Wyatt shifted in restless sleep. Then suddenly his voice came rough and faint through the fever. "Evelyn." She moved to the bedside immediately. His eyes barely opened, but his hand found hers anyway, weak, cold, still searching for her, even half-conscious. And when his fingers closed around hers, Evelyn realized something that frightened her worse than the flood ever had. She was no longer praying for Wyatt Granger to survive because the ranch needed him. She was praying because she did. The fever finally broke near sunrise. Evelyn had fallen asleep sitting beside the bed, with one hand still wrapped loosely around Wyatt's when she felt him move for real this time. Not restless, awake. The room smelled of coffee grounds, wet wool, and the last of the storm drifting through the cracked window frame. Wyatt looked pale against the pillow, one side of his face bruised dark beneath the eye. "You stayed," he said quietly. Evelyn straightened in the chair. "Somebody had to make sure you didn't die stubborn." A faint shadow of a smile touched his mouth before fading again. Downstairs, Noah moved around the kitchen, feeding wood into the stove, the way Wyatt usually did before dawn. The boy had hardly left the house in 2 days. Dr. Bennett stopped by that afternoon and declared Wyatt lucky enough to anger heaven twice. "Broken ribs," the doctor muttered while packing his bag. "Nothing punctured. Rest'll keep him alive if he's smart enough to take it." Wyatt looked away at that. Nobody in the room believed he knew how to rest. For the first time since arriving at Harper Ranch, he stayed inside the house through the night. At first, he protested, said the couch near the stove was enough. Evelyn ignored him and carried extra blankets downstairs anyway. He stopped arguing after that. Outside, the valley slowly dried beneath pale spring sunlight. The river dropped back inside its banks, leaving broken branches and muddy debris tangled along the lower pasture fence. Word spread fast through Red Hollow about the flood. Then faster after Heller Boone finally spoke. The old feed store owner arrived one windy morning carrying his hat in both hands and a folded receipt ledger tucked beneath one arm. He stood awkwardly near the porch like a man ashamed of arriving too late. "I should have said something sooner," he admitted. Evelyn let him inside without answering. Heller placed the ledger carefully on the kitchen table. Several pages had names circled in faded pencil. Payments, freight orders, deliveries sent toward the abandoned mining road. Silas Mercer's name appeared again and again. So did Sheriff Avery's. "They paid men to haul chemical waste out there all winter," Heller said quietly. "Told folks it was mining equipment." Wyatt sat silent near the stove, reading the pages slowly. Evelyn felt anger move through her, cold and steady now. No confusion left inside it anymore. Only certainty. The town meeting happened 3 days later inside the Red Hollow Trading Hall. By noon, nearly every rancher in the valley had gathered there, boots scraping across old wooden floors while rain clouds drifted low outside the windows. Mercer stood near the front talking confidently with Sheriff Avery until Evelyn walked inside. Conversation thinned almost immediately. She wore a dark blue dress she had not touched since her husband's funeral and carried Heller's ledger beneath one arm. Wyatt entered behind her slower than usual because of the ribs, one hand resting near his side beneath the coat. Then more men stepped in after him. Ranchers Wyatt had quietly helped over the past months. Fence repairs, water lines, flood trenches, men who now stood behind him without needing to be asked. Mercer noticed too late that the room had shifted against him. Sheriff Avery reached for authority first. "This ain't the place for accusations." "No," Evelyn answered calmly. "It's the place for truth." Her voice carried farther than she expected. Nobody interrupted her after that. She spoke plainly about the poisoned spring, the burned barn, the flood, the abandoned mining road. Then Noah stepped forward beside her, trembling slightly but refusing to back down. "I heard Mercer talking about it," the boy said. "Before the flood." Mercer's face darkened instantly. "You calling me a liar, boy?" Wyatt moved before Evelyn even saw him rise, not threatening. Just stepping between Noah and Mercer quietly enough to make the entire room still. "You already know the answer to that," Wyatt said. Outside, thunder rolled far off beyond the mountains. Heller finally handed the ledger to Judge Talbot from the county office. The old man read only a few pages before turning slowly toward Sheriff Avery. "You took money for this?" Avery said nothing. That silence finished him. By evening, Mercer and the sheriff were both under guard waiting transport east for formal charges tied to illegal dumping and fraud against neighboring ranches. When the crowd finally emptied from the hall, Evelyn stepped outside into cool spring air, feeling strangely weightless. The valley looked different, cleaner somehow. Wyatt joined her near the hitching rail. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded once. "I think so." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Wyatt looked toward the muddy road leading back home. Home. The word settled quietly between them. Summer passed gently after that. The north spring ran clear again. Horses returned healthy and strong through the lower fields. Buyers started coming from Missoula and Bannock, asking about Harper stock before autumn even arrived. People stopped calling it Dead Ranch. By September, the place carried laughter again. Real laughter. One warm evening near the end of summer, Evelyn stepped outside carrying folded blankets toward the barn out of habit more than necessity. Lantern light glowed softly through the open doors. Wyatt sat inside repairing a saddle stirrup with careful hands while crickets hummed outside beneath the darkening sky. He looked up when she entered. "You didn't have to bring those." "I know." She stood there a moment, listening to the quiet creak of leather beneath his hands. Then finally she spoke. "You know," her voice softened slightly, "there's no reason for you to sleep out here anymore." Wyatt went still, completely still. The barn lantern flickered gently across the scar near his jaw, while he looked at her like he wasn't fully certain he'd heard right. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small silver ring worn smooth with age. "My mother's," he said quietly. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Wyatt stood despite the pain still lingering in his ribs, and crossed the small distance between them. "I didn't come here looking for a home," he said, "but somewhere along the way, you became one." No grand speech followed. None was needed. Evelyn took the ring with trembling fingers while tears gathered silently in her eyes. Outside, the old windmill turned steady beneath the Montana night. Somewhere across the pasture, Noah ran laughing after one of the young colts near the fence line. And inside the house beyond the barn windows, warm lamplight spilled softly into the valley for the first time in a very long while. The barn no longer felt cold. Maybe that's what stays with people after stories like this one. Not the flood, not the fire, not even the fight for the ranch. It's the quiet things afterward. A chair pulled closer to the stove for someone who used to sleep alone in a barn. A boy laughing out in the pasture again. Boots left beside the same front door every night because there's finally a reason to come back home. And if you've ever carried something heavy for too long, if you've ever sat awake wondering whether anybody would truly stand beside you once life turned hard, then maybe you understand Evelyn a little better tonight. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive loud. Sometimes it rides in tired and cold, asking for nothing more than a place out of the storm. Wyatt didn't save that ranch by himself. Evelyn saved it too. She kept getting up every morning when most folks would have walked away. And maybe that's what love really is in the end. Not grand speeches, not perfect people, just two worn-out souls deciding to keep showing up for each other. If this story stayed with you, leave a simple home down in the comments. And if you'd like, stay a while longer with this channel. There are still more dusty roads, forgotten towns, wounded hearts, and quiet kinds of hope waiting in the stories ahead.